It wasn't in an argument or shouting matches or some public scene. It was in the sweltering Cape Cod heat, amid flowers hanging from gilded frames and glasses of sparkling wine, that everything became irrefutable. Grace Foster sat alone at a table at the back of the room, wearing a dress she'd bought on credit, with a knot in her stomach that had nothing to do with the food. The ceremony had passed, the photos too, and not a single one of them showed her pride or affection. No one approached her to ask if she needed anything. She looked more like an engagement guest than the woman who had raised the bride alone, cleaning toilets and waiting tables for more than 20 years. David, her new husband, had shaken her hand when she arrived, as if she were a caterer. His family barely acknowledged her. Grace tried to hold it together as she had all her life. Since the day she ran away from a violent man with her daughter, wrapped in a blanket, and $20 in her purse. She had forced herself not to break. But at that wedding, every fake smile stung like a razor. She had hand-stitched a handkerchief with Rebecca's initials, which she left next to the gift no one mentioned. And the worst part wasn't the indifference. It was the realization, finally, that her own daughter had been rehearsing for years how to erase her existence from the story she told about herself. Grace had no close family. She never had any. So at every major event in Rebecca's life, from the first day of kindergarten to the opening of the boutique, she was there, alone, but present. She never expected public acknowledgement, but she did expect some gratitude, a gesture, a look, a word confirming that her sacrifice hadn't been in vain. Instead, that afternoon on Cape Cod, she was given an envelope. Inside was a printed sheet of paper, unsigned, undedicated. It was a request for financial support for the event. $50,000. David said it as if it were a formality, as if it were logical that she would contribute that sum without question, after having already donated her retirement fund to open her daughter's store. Rebecca didn't look her in the eye. She merely murmured something about repaying everything you did for me, in a cold, almost administrative tone. It was then that Grace felt something inside her go out. Not suddenly, like a candle flickering before it dies. She calmly stood up, said she needed some air, and walked along the deserted beach as the sun began to set. In her pocket, the embroidered handkerchief was still folded, untouched. No one had wanted it. No one had noticed it was made by the same hands that, years before, had ironed school uniforms and cooked soups with what little was in the pantry. That walk, with bare feet and dry eyes, was the first moment in years that Grace seriously thought about leaving. Not giving up. Leaving. Finally. For weeks before the wedding, Grace had already noticed something wasn't right. Rebecca's calls became sporadic. Decisions about the boutique were made without her consultation, and David had begun to become overly involved in the business's finances. Although she was still legally the majority partner, no one asked her opinion. What at first seemed like the enthusiasm of a committed son-in-law soon turned into a series of suspicious transactions. Accounts opened in her name, expenses that didn't match, checks signed without authorization. It was her friend Sarah, a trusted lawyer, who convinced her to start recording everything, every paper, every transaction, every message. Grace didn't want to believe her daughter was in on it, but she also knew she couldn't keep pretending. That afternoon on Cape Cod, after the conversation about the envelope, she returned to the table with a decision made. She said nothing. She ate in silence what little she could and watched from afar as her daughter danced with David, laughing, twirling, posing for magazine-worthy photos. It wasn't the first time Grace had felt invisible, but never so replaced. In that instant, she didn't think of revenge. She thought of dignity, of not letting her story end as a footnote. When everyone was distracted by the toast, she took out her cell phone, opened the email she had prepared with Sarah, and pressed send. In less than 5 minutes, the legal notifications began arriving. The boutique's bank account was frozen. Investors were alerted. And David's smile, as he read the first alerts on his phone, was completely erased. The reaction was swift. David abruptly stood up from the table, his face pale, and walked toward the parking lot, talking on his phone. Rebecca followed him, confused, trying to understand what was happening. Grace stayed put. She didn't need any further explanation. She knew exactly what she'd done. She'd waited for just the right moment for everyone involved to find out at the same time. She'd bottled up years of humiliation, slights, and silence and channeled them into a single, calculated, legal, and final action. She didn't raise her voice, didn't make a scene. She just watched. Meanwhile, some guests began to notice the commotion, and the murmurs grew. Half an hour later, David's father, a man with a stern look in a grey suit, approached her. He wasn't rude, but he was direct. He wanted to know what was happening with the company in which, he claimed, her family had invested a considerable sum. Grace looked him in the eye and answered without hesitation. Your son diverted company funds into personal accounts. I have proof. And your investment is at risk because he believed I was as naive as I seemed. The man didn't respond immediately. He lowered his gaze, muttered something to himself, and walked away. At that moment, Grace understood that everything had been set in motion. The dominoes were falling, and she, for the first time in decades, wasn't in the victim's shoes. Rebecca walked back into the living room alone, her face pale and her eyes glassy. She walked straight up to her mother, and for the first time in years, she didn't wear the superior expression she'd adopted since David appeared in her life. What did you do? She asked softly, not yelling, not tearfully, but with a mixture of anger and fear. Grace didn't stand up. She didn't apologize. She just said, I protected what I built. And I protected myself. Something you stopped doing a long time ago. Rebecca tried to speak, but couldn't find the words. Inside, she knew her mother was right, but she wasn't ready to admit it yet. The chaos spread quickly. Some guests began to leave. Others whispered among themselves, jumping to conclusions. David didn't return to the room, and the event organizers didn't know who to consult to stay on schedule. The perfect wedding, with drones, violins, and numbered tables, was unraveling before everyone's eyes. But Grace didn't feel guilt. She felt relief. The kind of relief that comes when you stop trying to fit in somewhere you were. Never welcome. She had spent her entire life sacrificing her well-being for others, believing that was love. But that day, she understood that love also demands limits. And that a self-respecting mother is, sometimes, the only lesson left to teach. Grace rose from the table calmly. She didn't need to make speeches or dramatic explanations. Everything had already been said, in a way that couldn't be ignored or distorted. As she crossed the room toward the exit, some watched her with confusion, others with respect. There were no tears on her face, no anger, just a kind of tense peace. The kind that comes when one makes a decision that has been put off for too long. Outside, the sea breeze stirred the pendant lights that had been so carefully installed. She walked slowly along the wooden walkway, feeling each step as a closure. In the parking lot, Sarah was already waiting for her inside the car, the engine running. Grace sat silently, closed the door, and took a deep breath for the first time in hours. Sarah didn't ask anything. She just extended her hand and handed her an envelope. Inside were the final papers for the legal action they'd been planning for weeks. The official reactivation of her majority stake. the revocation of David's powers, and a full accounting of the financial misconduct. Everything was ready. It wasn't just an emotional reaction anymore. It was an act of justice. And this time, it wasn't to save anyone. It was to save herself. As the car rolled along the coastal road, Grace stared out the window, saying nothing. She wasn't thinking about revenge or what would come next for Rebecca and David. She was thinking about herself, about how she'd gotten to this point, about all the sleepless nights cleaning clinics, the lunches she'd skipped to pay for tutoring for her daughter, the shoes she'd patched over and over again. She was thinking about how she'd put off her entire life, believing that one day her efforts would be recognized, that, as Rebecca grew up, she'd see everything clearly, but that day never came. And now, for the first time, she understood that she couldn't continue hoping for love where there was only convenience. When they got home, Sarah offered to stay, but Grace shook her head. She wanted to be alone. She went in, took off her shoes, and sat down in the old armchair in the living room, the one she had bought used almost 15 years ago. On the table was still the box with the embroidered handkerchief. Number 1 had touched it. She carefully opened the lid, as if examining a relic, and held it in her hands for a long moment. Then she folded it again and put it in one of the boxes where she had previously kept Rebecca's drawings. That night she didn't cry. She didn't need to cry. She had already done it all in silence for years. What she needed now was something much more difficult. To start over. But this time, for herself. The next day, the phone didn't stop ringing. Texts, missed calls, emails. Rebecca left several audio recordings, at first outraged, then more desperate. "How could you do this at my wedding?" one said. "Please, Mom, talk to me," another said. But Grace didn't answer. Not out of pride, but because she understood there was an emotional distance between them that could no longer be bridged with words. For years, she had been the invisible net that held everything together. Now that she'd let go of the rope, everything had collapsed. And although it hurt, she also knew she couldn't continue being the support of a structure that only used her as a base to show off. The following days were chaotic for the boutique. Accounts were audited, audits initiated, suppliers demanding explanations. David disappeared from management, and Rebecca, with no real administrative experience, was forced to face the pressure. Grace didn't revel in the chaos. This wasn't that kind of victory she was looking for. But she didn't get in the way either. Her role was over. One morning, while drinking coffee in the kitchen, she felt something different. It wasn't happiness. It was ... space. A strange but necessary emptiness. The space that remains when you stop carrying the weight of others. And even if she didn't know what to do with that space yet, it was hers. Finally, hers. A week later, Grace found herself walking through the city centre with a folder in her hand. Inside were old sketches, magazine clippings, ideas she'd accumulated for years, but never allowed herself to seriously consider. They were always there, waiting for a someday that never came. She walked into a small rental corner space with good natural light and still empty walls, and asked to speak to the agent. As she walked through the space, she imagined every detail. The shelves, the fabrics, the handmade products made by women like her, who had been invisible for too long. This wasn't revenge. It was a beginning. On the door of the store was a sign that read, "Stories welcome, not just resumes." Grace smiled. She knew the sign wasn't hers yet, but the phrase resonated with her. She'd always had plenty of stories, but no one had asked for them. She left the store with her head held high. She had no certainties, no extra money, and no detailed plan. that she had something she hadn't felt in a long time. Autonomy. For the first time in decades, the decisions she was going to make wouldn't be out of fear, or duty, or misplaced loyalties. They would be for her. Only for her. Rebecca never reappeared in person. There were a few more messages, longer this time, where she mixed apologies with complaints. She said she'd acted under pressure, that David manipulated her, that she never meant to hurt her. But she also blamed Grace for ruining everything. None of the messages came with real accountability. And that, more than anything else, was what hurt the most. Grace didn't respond. Not because she was closing the door forever, but because she knew responding at that moment would only feed a cycle she no longer wanted to inhabit. Learning to set boundaries with someone you love is one of the most painful things there is, but it's also one of the most necessary. Over time, some of the boutique's old clients began to contact her. They'd heard rumors, knew something had happened. They wanted to know if Grace was planning to open something new. And that, more than anything, was what drove her to keep going. It wasn't just an emotional impulse. There was a real demand. A genuine interest in what she could offer. Thus, the idea of Races was born. A small shop that would not only sell clothes but also offer workshops, jobs for women over 50, and a space to share stories. It was her way of transforming pain into something useful, of rebuilding, that this time from within herself, without sacrificing her essence. The day they put up the Races opening soon sign, Grace stood alone in front of the window for a few minutes. She didn't do it to take a photo or to show it to anyone. She just needed that moment for herself. The logo was simple, handcrafted by a designer she met at a local fair. No flashy branding or empty slogans. Just a name that reflected what truly mattered, where she came from, and what could still flourish. It wasn't her daughter's boutique. It wasn't a gift to anyone. It was her project. Her life at its own pace. And that gave her a kind of quiet pride she'd never felt before. Little by little, she filled the store with colors, textures, and products from women like her. Single mothers, grandmothers who'd never earned their own income, artisans who made wonders with scraps. Grace spoke to each one, not as a businesswoman, but as an equal. She told them her story, but without drama. Just the facts. Because she no longer needed to embellish anything. Her strength came not from what she'd suffered, but from everything she'd rebuilt from those remains. Every garment in the store had a story. And each story, a woman who had stopped asking permission to exist. Just like her. One day, while sorting a box of new products in the warehouse, Grace found a crumpled envelope at the bottom of an old bag. It was the same envelope from the wedding collaboration request. She'd tucked it away without thinking, the way one tucks away things that are too painful to look at the moment. She opened it, read it again, and this time she didn't feel anger. She felt pity. Not for her. For Rebecca. For the woman she'd become, so concerned with fitting into a world that demanded not love, but appearance. Grace couldn't change that. She couldn't save her from herself, but she could choose to no longer carry guilt that wasn't hers. That night, as she closed the store, she put on some music on the antique radio she had restored with the help of a client. It played a soft bolero, the kind that fills the air without making a sound. She cooked something simple, poured herself a glass of wine, and sat down in her small, two-seater dining room. For the first time in years, she felt at home. Not because the place was new or perfect, but because it was hers. Every corner bore her imprint. Every choice, her will. And in that silence, without demands or disappointments, she understood something that no therapy or conversation had been able to teach her. That surviving was only the first step. Living truly was the next. And she was just getting started. As the months went by, Roots began to attract people who were not only looking for clothes, but also for comfort, community, a space where they didn't need to pretend. Women of different ages, backgrounds, and wounds found something there they didn't know they needed. Grace didn't promote herself as an expert on anything. She simply listened. Sometimes that was enough. One client confessed one afternoon that she had been feeling useless for years after her children left home. Another, that she had left a 40-year marriage and didn't know where to begin. Grace didn't give advice. She shared pieces of her story. And in that back and forth, everyone felt a little healing. Rebecca didn't write again. The silence continued. Sometimes, on more fragile days, Grace would check the mailbox hoping for a letter, a gesture, not out of a need for reconciliation, but because a mother's love, even when painful, isn't so easily extinguished. But over time, that desire softened. It no longer defined her. It no longer held her back. Grace understood that there are bonds that aren't broken by one event, but by many small, accumulated renunciations. And sometimes it's not about rebuilding, but about accepting that not everything can be recovered. Not without losing oneself in the process. One Sunday morning, as she was sweeping the sidewalk in front of the store, a young woman timidly approached her. She was one of the wedding attendants, someone Grace barely remembered among so many indifferent faces. She told her she had seen everything that day, that she had heard David yelling on the phone outside the hall, and that she would never forget the way Grace walked out, alone, but upright, as if nothing could break her. She thanked her for that. She said that seeing a woman who wouldn't tolerate being humiliated had made her think of her own mother. Grace smiled, surprised. She hadn't expected acknowledgement. But that comment confirmed something she had felt for some time. That sometimes breaking the silence is not only a personal act, but also a beacon for others. That same afternoon, she received a call from Sarah. The legal proceedings against David had progressed, and the evidence of embezzlement was overwhelming. The original boutique was still operating, but under new management. Rebecca had had to sell some of her shares to cover debts and settlements. Sarah asked if Grace wanted to be involved in the final settlement of the case, but she said no. She didn't need any more legal resolutions. She'd already done what she needed to do. And most importantly, she no longer had anything to prove. Not to the system, not to her daughter, not to herself. The nights were different now. Grace no longer went to bed anxiously checking bills, nor with the anguish of wondering if her daughter was okay. She had learned to stop living on alert. Her routine was simple. Close the store, prepare something light, water the plants on the balcony, and read a little before bed. Sometimes she jotted things down in a notebook. They weren't diaries or confessions, just fragments, loose phrases that came to mind. One of them she repeated several times. It was never selfishness. It was surviving without disappearing. That phrase stayed with her, because for too long she'd been led to believe that setting boundaries meant being ungrateful. But it wasn't. It was saving herself. One afternoon, she organized a small gathering at races with clients and friends from the neighborhood. Each one shared something. A piece of fabric, a recipe, a life story. It was warm, real, unpretentious. Grace hadn't planned to speak, but someone asked her to tell how the shop began. She did so without embellishment. She spoke of exhaustion, of abandonment, of the process of recovering her voice. There were no tears, just a profound calm in her words. When she finished, an older woman approached her and said, "You didn't lose a daughter. You gained the rest of your life." And although the statement was harsh, Grace knew she was right. Not because she stopped loving Rebecca, but because she had learned not to let herself go for love. On one of those quiet days, Grace received a small package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a printed photo. Her and Rebecca, sitting on the floor of their first apartment, surrounded by boxes and used clothes. It was the day they'd arrived in the city, escaping the past. On the back, written in blue ink, it simply read, "Sorry I forgot all this." There was nothing else. Not a letter, not a call afterward. Just that image and that sentence. Grace sat for a long time with the photo in her hands. She didn't cry. She didn't react with euphoria or sadness. She just carefully put it in a box that also held her papers from the store. It was a gesture, not a reconciliation. But it was something. That same day, as she closed the shop, she looked at the Races sign from outside, as if she were a customer for the first time. She allowed herself to admire what she had, built not with empty pride, but with gratitude. She knew that life wasn't going to give back what she had given, but she also knew that she had learned to give herself what she always denied by prioritizing others. Care, presence, courage. She wasn't a heroine. She was a woman who had been broken and who decided not to stay there. And that in a world that insists on demanding silence, patience, and limitless sacrifice was enough. Perhaps more than enough. One Saturday, while sweeping the front of the store, a little girl passing by with her mother stopped to look in the window. She pointed to an embroidered blouse and said, "When I grow up, I want to work here." Grace smiled, opened the door, and invited them in. Not to sell, but to show off. Grace's mother thanked her and told her they always stopped by because the place gave them good energy. It was a simple comment, but it stuck with Grace, because for years, no one had associated her with anything good. She was the one who put in the effort, the one who sacrificed, the one who endured. To be seen now as someone building something bright, even on a small block in the neighborhood, was a silent reparation. That night, as she jotted down random phrases in her notebook, she wrote something she didn't know if she'd ever show anyone. Sometimes, losing the one you love most doesn't destroy you. It reveals you. That line closed the page. It also closed a cycle. Because Grace knew that not all wounds heal with hugs or reunions. Some heal in solitude, with silent work, with firm decisions, with the courage to never look back. She didn't know if Rebecca would ever return, or if their bond could ever be rebuilt. But she no longer lived for that. Now finally, she lived for her. And that, in her story, was a revolution. A month later, Races celebrated its first anniversary. There was no big party, no distinguished guests. Just a table with coffee, homemade cakes, and a few customers who already felt a part of the place. Grace didn't make any speeches. She quietly thanked everyone, hugged those who wanted to stay a little longer, and sat back to watch the action from the back of the store. There, amid simple laughter and everyday conversations, she realized she had built much more than a business. She had created a refuge, one where she too fit in, one where she didn't need to justify her existence, when no one asked her to prove her worth. When she closed the door that night, she lowered the blinds with steady hands, unhurriedly. The air was fresh, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't think about what she had lost. She thought about what she had saved. Herself. She walked home slowly, without checking her phone, without waiting for messages. Not because she didn't care, but because finally, her peace didn't depend on anyone else. And as she turned the corner, her heart at peace, she knew that this version of herself, the one who survived, the one she chose, the one who rebuilt herself without witnesses was, in the end, the most honest of all.